Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this very warm welcome. I can see immediately that I'm not like the bishop who turned up at a country church in England, and as he was mounting the podium, he saw that there were only 3 elderly people in the audience. And he turned to the minister and he whispered to him, "Did you tell them I was coming?" And the minister said, "No, but word seems to have got around." It is a special honor to be invited to speak at a university whose motto is Die Luft der Freiheit weht. The wind of freedom blows. And one of the exciting things in my life is to have been allowed to have the intellectual freedom to think. I have been fascinated since childhood by logical analysis. And as a boy, I came across Euclidean geometry, wonderful stuff, from which the magic theorems of Pythagoras could be deduced by logical wizardry from a very few postulates or axioms. And one of the things that people asked, I learned, was, did you need all the axioms to construct the system? And very soon I came across the fascinating fact that for centuries people had tried to deduce the parallel axiom, Euclid's 5th postulate, from the others, and they couldn't do it. And it took centuries for Bolyai eventually and Lobachevsky to show that you could construct non-Euclidean geometries that did not satisfy the parallel axiom. Euclid's geometry turned out to be very useful for calculations involving fields and buildings. But what about these new geometries? Turned out that they were exactly what was needed to study space-time, and they were crucial to Einstein's amazing work on relativity. It was heady stuff for a schoolboy. And so I fell in love with axiomatic systems. And I hope you have done as well. Indeed, I have spent my life trying to work out some of the inferences that can be logically made from the 4 axioms that characterize the abstract mathematical objects called groups, that find application in the study of symmetry wherever it occurs, in crystallography, particle physics, relativity theory, etc. And you wouldn't think 4 axioms could lead to much, but they've led to some of the most complex results in mathematics. Indeed, the longest result, the classification of finite simple groups in my field, initially took 10,000 journal pages to prove, and rates as one of the most complex achievements in intellectual history. I did not prove it, ladies and gentlemen. But very soon I began to wonder about science itself. Does it have axioms in any perhaps less formal sense? Does it involve beliefs, fundamental postulates that lie at its heart? Scientists appeared to be interested in finding out truth about the universe out there. And hence the attempt to find axiomatic mathematical systems that gave us some insight about the real world. Then I discovered there were different axioms about truth itself. I found, to my amazement, that there were some people who believed that there was no absolute truth, and yet they expected me to believe that their axiom was absolute truth. A self-contradictory axiom? I was not convinced that anything sensible could be built on that, and I am still unconvinced. I noted that many of these people were not scientists. At least if they were, they left their postmodernism outside the laboratory. But at the opposite extreme, I found scientists who not only believed that there was truth, that they were getting nearer and nearer to, so they thought, although they would never claim to have reached it absolutely. They also believed as axiomatic that science was the only way to truth. Bertrand Russell expressed their view so well. What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Sounds very impressive. And I admire Russell for his philosophy and logic, but it forsook him when he wrote that, didn't it? Think of the statement, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Is it a statement of science? Well, no, it is not. So you cannot know it. Is it too late at night for logic, ladies and gentlemen? Such scientism, however, though logically contradictory, appears common today. It seemed to me very curious that so many contemporary scientists, including Richard Dawkins, are prepared to believe in a self-contradictory notion. Far wiser was Nobel Prize winner Sir Peter Medawar, who said it does no service to science to claim that science is capable of answering every question. He says it's so easy to see that science is limited. It cannot begin to answer, for instance, the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life? And interestingly, he added, it is to religion and imaginative literature that we need to turn for answers to those questions. Science is powerful, and I am committed to it. I spent all my life doing mathematics. But it seems to be immensely important to realize right at the beginning of our lecture that, first of all, science is limited. It tends to deal with the how questions or the why questions of function as distinct from the why questions of purpose. And secondly, it is not coextensive with rationality. Otherwise, you'd have to close half the faculties in Stanford University. Which is an interesting thought, isn't it? Which some of you might not so readily agree to. But what about the reality that science studied? Were there axioms about it? In the sense, was there such a thing as ultimate reality? And then I discovered that although there are, in a sense, very many worldviews, there were two major worldviews that come barreling up to us through history from the ancient Greek world, facing this fundamental question, what is ultimate reality? There were the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus, for whom ultimate reality was mass energy, as we would say today. There was no transcendence. And therefore, by definition, everything must be explicable bottom up, because there is no transcendent top-down causation in any ultimate sense. But then there were others, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and almost all the great thinkers of classical antiquity, who believed that this universe was not all that existed, who believed that there was transcendence, who believed that there were gods or there was God. And I discovered as life went by that those two views are in the academy today, very well represented in my own University of Oxford. But then another thought struck me. Could these worldview commitments about the nature of ultimate reality intersect with people's concept of what science actually was? What about my own worldview? Because I then discovered that I was not a completely dispassionate, desiccated mind, completely objective. No one is. And so as we sit here, ladies and gentlemen, tonight, every one of us brings a worldview to the table. Our set of answers to the big questions. It may be well formed. It may be scarcely beginning to be formed. And one of the exciting things is about the university is to have the freedom to think about it and form our worldview. Now, I admit to you immediately, I am prejudiced. That is, I have a worldview. And I want to explain to you a little bit about my autobiography so that you can understand where I'm coming from and why these issues are of interest to me. I come from Northern Ireland, a sectarian country, which hasn't exactly the highest reputation for Christian peacemaking. My parents were remarkable people. They were Christian without being sectarian, and it cost them quite a lot to maintain that stance, employing equally across the very divided religious community. Secondly, they were even more remarkable than that. They allowed me to think. That was a luxury not enjoyed by many of my contemporaries. They give me space. They loved me enough to allow me to think. And so at a very early age, I was being encouraged by my parents to read all kinds of things, from C.S. Lewis to the Communist Manifesto. And that helped my intellectual development. So the first worldview I met was a Christian worldview. Then I came to Cambridge last century. And that was a very interesting experience. Because in my first week as a student, I got talking, as most Irish do, with my fellow students. And one of them said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, sorry, I asked the question. You're Irish. I forgot. All you Irish believe in God and you fight about it." I'd heard that before. But now it was earnest. Here I was at one of the intellectual centers of the world. Could it be that my parents were Christian, my grandparents and their parents? Of course I was a Christian. It's Irish genetics. It's Irish spiritual DNA. And so I came across an axiom that some people use all too readily. It's called the genetic fallacy. Let me put it up to date for you and you'll understand immediately what I mean. Have you ever heard one person say to another, "You say that because you're a woman"? Have you ever heard that? Oh, you'd never hear that in Stanford, would you? Okay, you believe that because you're a man. And that causation explanation is an argument for not taking seriously what you say. Do you notice that? If you can explain a genetic cause, it removes significance from the statement. So I was faced with this, that what I believed was, of course, mythology, simply because I was Irish. You could give a cause for it, and therefore it wasn't true. It's a very interesting bit of logic, isn't it? It doesn't hold very much water when you analyze it. But I took it very seriously, because I'd never met many people who did not share my worldview. So I decided to change that in my first week at Cambridge. And I'm afraid I must confess my naivety, ladies and gentlemen, but let me confess it. I imagined that somebody with a beard would probably be an atheist. I've since discovered that that's nonsense, of course. There's some delightful people with beards, and I had one for a while. And until my wife got rid of it. And I looked around, and sure enough, there was a man with a beard. He wasn't an atheist, but he was an agnostic. Never been to church. His parents had never been to church. So I entered into a dialogue with him. And that started a compass bearing for my life. An interest in befriending people who didn't have my background, who didn't share my axioms, who had other axioms, that is, other, in an informal sense, fundamental postulates that guided their life, because I was interested in veritas, truth. I was not interested in whether Christianity was helpful or not helpful, or atheism was helpful or not helpful. I was interested in whether it corresponded with reality in the same way as non-Euclidean geometry corresponded with space-time. And so my search and my dialogue began. It, of course, has led in recent years to debates with Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. amongst many other people, Michael Shermer, and so on, Victor Stenger. And so what I'm going to do tonight is mix the past with the present in order to explain to you a little bit of the thinking that's developed over the years in these areas. My visit to Germany with the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation gave me an interest in languages, at least developed my interest, and I got German fluently. Mathematics, of course, pure mathematics is a language. Language is compression of ideas into symbols in a concise form. And I've always been fascinated in languages, from symbolic languages to natural human languages. And so that explains a bit of my interest. And that took me to Eastern Germany in the communist time, and gave me an opportunity to see at first hand what the axiom of atheism did to people intellectually when it formed a pressure within society directly. What it led to was intellectual murder. I saw there that the wind of freedom did not blow. I met weeping children of the age of 13 who had been denied a higher education. Why? At school. Because they would not publicly swear allegiance to the atheistic state. That's criminal, isn't it? And when you've seen a few things like this, you begin to be concerned about some of the tendencies within our contemporary world. But then 1989 came and the wall collapsed, and I helped to knock it down. Gently, of course. But nonetheless, I did. And that opened up a new era. I had been for years a translator of mathematical Russian. I never realized one day I'd have to speak the language, so I had to learn it very fast. And so I ended up in Siberia on a two-way ticket. And I started lecturing in the Academy of Sciences, on mathematics, of course. And to my utter surprise, the following happened. I want you to imagine this happening in the Maths Institute in Stanford. I give a lecture on algebra. Wonderful stuff it is. And I politely answer the questions that come, and they last for about 3 minutes. And then the people say, we got some other questions that we'd like to ask you, Professor Lennox. Oh, what are they? We hear you believe in God. Why? Can you imagine that here? It happened everywhere in the Academy of Sciences. And then hour after hour, I would be put under pressure by these people. How is it possible for an intelligent person like you, they were very kind, to believe in God? It was fascinating. And I wish I had time to tell you of the way in which I immediately got in among the dissidents and discovered men who'd been put in prison for 7 years simply for lending another friend a samizdat, a hand-copied version of one of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's books. And I remember one man, and he didn't seem bitter about it at all. And I said, aren't you bothered about this? He said, listen, you don't understand. In those days, the Gulag was the best university Russia had because all the brains were there. But he said, don't go there now. They're all criminals now. Why were they interested in God? I shall never forget, ladies and gentlemen, one brilliant academician said, I'll tell you why. We thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. We discovered we couldn't. We tried to build a new man. And we learned too late that Dostoevsky was right when he said, Если Бога нету и всё позволено. If God does not exist, everything is permissible. He was a prophet. Interesting, isn't it? This was a scientist. This was a highly educated man, realizing that the fabric of his country had unraveled because of an idea that had been imposed by force as the norm on the community. I'm not sure I want to see it again, ladies and gentlemen. Do you? Dostoevsky, of course, did not mean that atheists couldn't behave. Of course they can. Sometimes my many atheist friends put me to shame in their concern for other people. What he meant was there's no rational ground ultimately for morality if there's no God. Now that would be a big question for another evening. Now for them, they had an axiom, and that was that God didn't exist. And I said, how do you know God doesn't exist? What do you mean, they said, by asking the question, how do you know? And I was puzzled by this. Well, I said, that's the logical question to ask. Oh, but they said it isn't. God doesn't exist. Well, I said, wait a minute, that's an assertion. What is your evidence for the truth of that assertion? Evidence, they said. What's evidence got to do with it? And then it suddenly dawned on them, and they turned round to me in utter amazement. They said, surely you don't believe that there's evidence that God does exist, do you? I said, of course I do. Otherwise, I'd be a fool to believe it. But wait a minute. You've got faith in God. I said, that's right. But isn't faith believing what you know isn't true? I'm very glad you laugh. I find many professors in Oxford that believe exactly that. That faith is a religious concept that means believing something for which there's no evidence. And the inference is, therefore, there's no need to discuss it. And there was such a novelty in Russia in those days that you might even consider evidence, that faith could be an evidence-based thing. There is an immense confusion in our society even today about the nature of faith. Dawkins, for instance, thinks that a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus but harder to eradicate. Now here comes his definition. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. Scientific belief. Notice he changes the word faith to belief, although they mean exactly the same thing. Scientific belief, faith, is based upon publicly checkable evidence. Religious faith, change of word again, not only lacks evidence, its independence from evidence is its joy, shouted from the rooftops. And so the new atheists, in common with many of my Russian friends, thought of faith as a particularly religious term that meant belief without evidence. By the same token, in their view, scientific belief is not faith, an instant oxymoron, incidentally. But faith that is not based on evidence is what most of the rest of us would call blind faith. The kind of faith that drives aircraft into tall buildings. It can be extremely dangerous, as fanatical extremists have demonstrated with sickening regularity. However, we only have to look at a dictionary to see that faith is not necessarily blind. The Oxford English Dictionary, not a bad place to start, of course, tells us that the word faith in English derives from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity. So its basic meaning is, I quote, trust, rely on. The Latin fides, like its Greek etymological cognate pistis, which it renders in the New Testament, had the following principal sentence, I'm still quoting, senses, belief, trust, that which produces belief, evidence, token, pledge, engagement, trust in its objective aspect, and so on. So the main dictionary definition of faith is belief, trust, confidence, and so on. It is therefore evident that the validity of faith or belief depends on the strength of the evidence on which the belief is based. And for most of us in this room, that is the common sense view. Asked to believe something, we instinctively want to know what the supporting evidence is, especially if we are bank managers and people are approaching us for a loan. A banker will not trust a potential borrower with a substantial loan unless she has seen sufficient evidence on which to base that trust. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, whether or not we have faith in bankers is a very different matter. But the whole thing that has happened in the financial world illustrates it brilliantly. That faith without a base paralyzes the system. And one of the big problems we're up against is the recovery of faith so that the financial system can get to work again. And for that recovery, you need evidence. Now, I tried to make this point in my first debate with Richard Dawkins when he asserted that faith is blind. And I asked him if he had evidence for faith in his wife. So immediately he said, well, I mean, of course, a husband notices these little things, these little looks and glances, you know the kind of thing I mean. So there's plenty of evidence. So I said, so you do believe in evidence-based faith then? Oh, he said, that's not faith, but it was far too late. It is staggering, ladies and gentlemen, how scientists claiming intellectual integrity will deny what is obvious from a simple reading of the Oxford English Dictionary. But the next logical question is, well, what about the Christian faith? Is it blind or evidence-based? Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot speak for other religions. They must speak for themselves, and it is right that they should. I am a Christian. And my concern, therefore, is my faith in God evidence-based? Well, what does it itself claim? Let's take a prime example. One of the authors of the Gospels, the Apostle John, writes this. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. John is saying, here's the evidence. I've selected this evidence. Jesus did this, and it's evidence in order that you might believe. In other words, faith is not a leap in the dark. It's the exact opposite. It is a commitment based on evidence. Atheists in Russia and elsewhere often claim that the Christian faith is a delusion, a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. I'm giving Dawkins' definition in his book, The God Delusion. However, I want to suggest to you tonight that the boot is on the other foot. It is the atheist concept of faith as blind by definition that is a delusion according to their own definition of a delusion. It is a persistent false belief held in the teeth of strong contrary evidence. It is irrational to reduce all faith to blind faith and then subject to ridicule. That provides a very anti-intellectual and convenient way of avoiding intelligent discussion. And I'm tempted to describe it as extremely intellectually lazy. But you see, there's another side. The failure to understand what faith is leads to another very serious error, and that is to think that neither atheism nor science involves faith. And the double irony is that atheism is a faith, and science itself cannot do without faith, as I hinted earlier when talking about axioms. When Richard Dawkins said to me in a debate that atheism was not a faith, I said, why don't you believe it? It's elementary, isn't it? They claim to believe it. It is a faith. But perhaps more importantly, in common with all other scientists, he and I could not do our science without believing, having faith in, the rational intelligibility of the universe. This fundamental postulate of science has always fascinated me, as it fascinated Einstein and Wigner. Because the goal of science, at least in the opinion of most, is not to impose on the matter and workings of the universe our human sense of order, but to unveil and discover the universe's own order and intelligibility. And of course that means that scientists have always had to assume before they start their investigations that the universe does have an inherent order and intelligibility. If they didn't believe it existed, there would be no motivation to do research. Listen to physicist Paul Davies of the ASU, a very distinguished scientist, leader of the SETI project, and a brilliant writer. He says the right scientific attitude is essentially theological. Come again? The right scientific attitude is essentially theological. Science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Even the most atheistic scientists, he writes, accepts as an act of faith the existence of law-like order in nature that is at least in part comprehensible to us. Einstein, no less, wrote, "Science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding. This source of feeling, however, springs from religion. To this there also belongs the faith," note, "in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational, that is, comprehensible to reason." I cannot imagine a scientist without that profound faith. The situation may be expressed in an image. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And yet, it surprises me enormously how deep the feeling runs that evidence somehow displaces faith rather than justifying it. A wonderful example was given by Christopher Hitchens. If one must have faith to believe in something, then the likelihood of that something having truth or value is considerably diminished. What? Exit science then. Exit also Christopher Hitchens, as I pointed out to him in another debate. After all, on the presumption that Christopher Hitchens has sufficient faith to believe in his own existence, that belief, which is faith, would tell me that the likelihood that he actually exists is considerably diminished. I'm not actually impressed with that kind of logic, ladies and gentlemen. Worse still, what he says about faith refutes itself, since he expects us to believe it. It is a statement of his faith, what he says about faith. And that's a thing I noticed from my boyhood. And I've got antenna for it. And that's logically self-contradictory assertions that unconsciously accept the person making the assertions. Like, for example, what I said before. If I come to you and say, there is no such thing as absolute truth, but I'm expecting you to believe that is true. I'm accepting myself from the consequences of my own universalized observation. And there's something very strange about that, especially if you find it among scientists. Interestingly enough, my professor of quantum physics at Cambridge, Sir John Polkinghorne, points out that physics is powerless to explain its faith. Notice his use of the term, in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, for the simple reason that you cannot begin to do physics without believing in that intelligibility. But now we come to the next level. If I, as a scientist, have faith that the universe is rationally accessible, what is the warrant for that belief? Now, that's a question that philosophers are increasingly asking. Because we notice, or at least I hope we've noticed, that our human reason did not create the universe, unless we are very extreme idealists. Nor did we create our own powers of reason. We can develop our rational abilities, but we didn't originate them. So how is it, please, that what goes on in the head of the mathematician as she thinks, and all these equations, how can they correspond to a reality outside? That is something that the really great physicists and cosmologists wondered at. Eugen Wigner, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said it's irrational, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. And it is from a certain point of view. And that point of view is this. And it's ironic in a way. What is the origin of the human faculty of reason? Well, as I understand it from Richard Dawkins and others, human reason is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Why should I trust anything it says then? A process which, incidentally, they claim is geared not to truth but survival. As the chemist J.B.S. Haldane said years ago, if the thoughts in my mind are just the motions of atoms in my brain, a mechanism that has arisen by mindless, unguided processes, why should I believe anything it tells me, including the fact that it's made of atoms? In particular, what grounds are there to believe that the philosophy of atheism is true? I want to submit to you that my major problem with atheism has got nothing to do with Christianity or my belief in God. It has to do with the fundamental worldview postulate that undermines the rationality that I need to do science. It's a very interesting impasse to come to, isn't it? That's my chief criticism of the new atheism. As I say, it's got nothing to do with my belief in God. And as the distinguished North American philosopher Alvin Plantinga of Notre Dame has pointed it out. He says if Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including his own. That is, atheistic reductionism goes too far, and it undermines the reality, the rationality that science needs. Dare I suggest that, by contrast, biblical theism is completely coherent in its explanation of why the universe is scientifically and mathematically intelligible. Because it teaches that God is ultimately responsible as creator, both for the existence of the universe out there and the human mind in here. And hence the human mind is capable in part of understanding it. But there's more. Because this fits in with the history of modern science itself. Historians of science have often asked the question, why is it that modern science exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe? And the major answer, there are all kinds of disagreements about nuances and so on, but the major answer is well summed up in the words of C.S. Lewis. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. My mind instantly goes back to a group like this, same size of a crowd. Academy of Sciences, Akademgorodok, Novosibirsk, Siberia, 1989. Front row, KGB. And I started to tell them, having been invited to give the first lecture in 75 years, why a mathematician believes in God, a bit like tonight. Very first one that had ever happened, permission of the rector, absolutely packed. We were given 25 seats and 20% of the entire university came. We had to take over the biggest auditorium. Terrifying, actually. I started to tell them, quite innocently really, about the history of science. And I said, of course, you know, Galileo and Kepler and Newton and Clerk Maxwell and Babbage and Boyle and all these people believed in God. And there was dead silence. And I noticed, and I got a bit scared, that some of these guys in the first row, these heavyweight professors and so on, looked very angry. So I stopped being a timid Irishman. And I said, excuse me, I can't help noticing that something's wrong. What's the problem? And one man got up and said, why were we never told this? Well, that's one of the easiest questions I've ever had in my life to answer. They were angry. I said, what do you mean? They said, we never, ever, in all our study of science, were told that any of these people were theists. And were angry. Interesting, isn't it? The wind of freedom blows, does it? Freedom to know about the past. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a common myth, another axiom, informally, going around in the world today, that belief in God and science conflict. Belief in God was the motor that drove science. I'm not ashamed, you see, about that fact. A year later, I was invited by the Club of Rome. You've probably heard the intellectual think tank, the Club of Rome and the Academy of Sciences, to a great conference again in Novosibirsk. First time I've ever traveled in a Russian private jet, but that's another story. And there was a lecture. Several of us were giving lectures, and one professor got very cross with me. I don't know why, but he got very cross. And he said, look, this man is disseminating ideas that are very dangerous. Well, I didn't think I was all that dangerous looking. And he went over to a blackboard and he drew a stroke of lightning on the blackboard. And he said, look at this. This man would teach you that God was behind that, you see. And he said, we know that it's to do with electricity and clouds and all kinds of natural processes. And as science advances, such a God of the gaps disappears. Ever heard that argument before? And he was very steamed up. So eventually I was allowed right of reply, which was very difficult to get. And I said, well, it's very interesting. You feel very strongly about this, clearly. But let me tell you, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. A God that disappeared when you discovered how lightning worked wouldn't be worth believing in, would he? And I said, I suppose by the same analogy, if you found out how a computer worked, you wouldn't believe in, that it had ever been invented by anybody, would you? And he came to me and he said, we need to talk. I said, we do. And we did. It turned out he'd been burned by a defective form of Christianity. But ladies and gentlemen, this is a major issue in the academy today. Stephen Hawking, in his recent book, presents us with the choice, God or the law of gravity. I've just written a book about it. Richard Dawkins presents us with a choice, God or science. You either have that explanation or the other one. That is, they are assuming that God is the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. That is, of course, absurd. You only have to think of it for a moment. Science is a set of intellectual disciplines. God is a person, the creator. What would you think if I offered you the following choice? Let's imagine that sitting in front of here is a Ford motor car engine. And I say I offer you two possible explanations. You've got to choose. Explanation number one, the law of internal combustion in engineering. Explanation two, Henry Ford. Choose. This is very high academic stuff, isn't it? But in book after book, we find we're being given that choice between God and science. It is a set of false alternatives. When Newton discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, wonderful, I know how it works, I've got a law, I don't need God. No, he wrote Principia Mathematica, the most brilliant book in the history of science, with the express hope that a thinking person would be brought by it to believe in God. That is, he didn't make the elementary philosophical category mistake between mechanism and law on the one side and agency on the other. It's so simple from a philosophical point of view. And to explain, that word explain is a very interesting word. To explain a Ford motor engine, in all senses you need both. They're not alternatives, they don't compete. They're not mutually exclusive. You need both an agent description and you need a mechanism and law description. But yet Stephen Hawking offers us precisely that in his book. It's far worse than that, actually, because laws don't create anything. But I've argued that in my book, and I can't stop to argue it now. I must rapidly come to an end. In my visits to Russia, I used to come across another assumption. Well, it was always turned into a question, and I got it all over the place in the academy. And they say to me, now look, if you say God created the universe, logically you have to ask who created God. Have you ever heard that before? Yes, it's the heart of Richard Dawkins' God delusion, isn't it? I thought I'd heard the end of it in Russia, but it's come over to Britain. It's a wonderful argument, isn't it? Who created the creator, and then who created the creator that created the creator that created, and so on. If you ask the question, who created the creator, by definition, you're thinking of a created creator, aren't you? If you ask the question, who created God, you're thinking of a created God. If Richard Dawkins had retitled his book, The Created God's Delusion, it wouldn't have sold many copies, would it? Because we don't need him or anybody else to tell us that created gods are a delusion. You see, what the question does is to duck the real issue. Is there a God who's not created? To ask who created God assumes that anything that comes under the category God is by definition created. But what if he isn't? And the central claim of the great monotheistic faith is, of course, that God is eternal. When Dawkins faced me with this in public, I said, you think this is a legitimate question? And he said, yes. Well, okay. I said, let me apply it to you. If it's legitimate, I don't think it is, but you think it is. So I said, you believe the universe created you. Right, who created your creator? I'm waiting for the answer. I haven't heard it until today. It works both ways. It is, as we always knew, a very silly question. And it's a very silly question to place at the middle of a major book. Now, there are lots of other things that I could say. But ladies and gentlemen, let me just pull it together this way, if I may. In the academy today, we find two worldviews. The atheistic worldview is frequently assumed in my country, I can't talk about yours, as the default position. And everybody else has to justify their place at the table. I hold that to be false. I hold there to be no default view, so we all have the right, in true intellectual freedom, to sit at the table. What are these two worldviews? Well, very briefly put, one is that mass energy is everything there is. And everything else, including mind and the idea of God, must be deducible bottom up. The other view is the exact opposite. It's that mind is primary and God is primary, and mass energy are derivative. I referred earlier to the statement of the evangelist John. He said some astonishing things. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. That is, God the Logos is primary. Everything else is derivative. And ladies and gentlemen, as a scientist, I want to submit to you that that makes sense of science, whereas the alternative view at the deeper level makes no sense at all. I recall vividly when I was 19 as a student in the University of Cambridge, being called into the room of a Nobel Prize winner with whom I had tried to engage in conversation at dinner. He brought several other professors with him, no students. He told me to sit down. He said, "Young man, do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Give up this childish belief in God if you want a career in science. It will cripple you intellectually." That was pressure, wasn't it? I can feel it today. I said, "Sir, what have you got to offer me that's intellectually more respectable than what I already have?" And he said, "Bergsonian emergent evolution." Well, I said, "Don't then be surprised that I'm going to stick with what I've got." I'm glad he wasn't like Leland Stanford, who at the inauguration of this university said to the students, "Remember that life is above all practical, and you are here to fit yourselves for a useful career. Learning should not only make you wise in the arts and sciences, but should fully develop your moral and religious natures." Jane Stanford, his wife, carved in stone in the chapel that sits at the center of this campus, although certain people wanted it at the periphery originally, said, "There is no narrowing so deadly as the narrowing of man's horizon of spiritual things. No worse evil could befall him in his course on earth than to lose sight of heaven. And it is not civilization that can prevent this. It is not civilization that can compensate for it. No widening of science, no possession of abstract truth can indemnify for an enfeebled hold on the highest and central truths of humanity. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" Ladies and gentlemen, Leland and Jane Stanford did not think that that view inhibited the blowing of the wind of the freedom to think. I hope you don't either. Thank you very much. Okay.
What we'd like to do may be slightly different from how you may have seen Q&A sessions done before. What we'd like to do is to take about 6 questions, and Professor Lennox will write those down, and then after we have those written down, then he will go ahead and respond to all 6, one after the other. And that will help people focus your questions so that you can state them succinctly, hopefully. And hopefully we'll be able to cover more questions in the time we have than we otherwise would. So we have people at, we have a question over here? Yeah. Yes, are you ready? Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead, please.
It's like a 2-part question. Is there a difference between mathematical proofs and philosophical proofs? And also, do you believe that the proofs of God are inescapable, or is there room for you being wrong?
Thank you.
Okay, over here.
Hi, Professor Lennox. I'd like to see
Hi.
if you could expand on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. One, is it pronounced Gödel or Gödel? I've never figured it out. But my real question, though, is does the incompleteness theorem apply not only to mathematical sets, but also for beings? I mean, like, for instance, would it apply to a 4-dimensional being, in that a 4-dimensional being would never be able to prove all the known theorems in a 4-dimensional space within the 4-dimensional space. He would have to go outside to the 5- or 6-dimensional space. And then secondly, as we know, Gödel's theorem does not apply to an infinite series. So would it be wrong to say that it only applies to finite beings, and thus an infinite being like God would not be limited by his theorem?
Thanks.
All right.
Professor Lennox, thank you for your sharings. While we justly criticize the phenomena of God-believing students in formerly atheist countries of being unable to study because of an atheistic environment, then couldn't opponents or supporters of Christianity, for that matter, also criticize past Christian kingdoms for the fact that some students were unable to pursue knowledge because of maybe their agnostic or atheistic belief? Moreover, if we do not want actions done in the name of Christianity to be associated with the doctrines of Christianity, how should we approach the relationship between atheism and actions done in the name of atheism? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Is he done writing?
I'm writing as fast as I can.
Let me know when you're ready.
Number 4, right?
All right.
You ready? Okay. In your personal opinion, why is it that both Dawkins and these prominent atheists hold to their views in light of the arguments that you've presented, and why is it so popular for people, just in general, the general populace, to believe them?
Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, given the fact that every day when we cross the road, our visual system needs to be accurate enough to distinguish a truck coming towards me to survive, why do you think that for fragile hydrocarbon beings like us, tracking reality is not actually identical to knowing the truth about the real universe around us? Thank you.
Okay. Are we done?
One more.
Hello, Professor Lennox. My question has to do with the search for God and the growth and understanding of science. I come from a place in Central Africa where people are very attached to very traditional and non-Christian understanding of God. And it seems to be very popular in Africa, and yet it's been a long time since any scientific discovery has been associated with the continent, and yet on a daily basis, they seem to be this search and this attachment to God. And where is the disconnection? Is it literacy? What is it from your understanding?
Okay.
Okay.
I thought I was going to be able to keep writing so as I wouldn't have to answer any of them. Thank you for the questions. I collect questions because this, to me, is now the very interesting bit. And thank you very much for thinking of these questions and raising them. And I'll not necessarily go through them in the order that they came, because we'll try and group them a little bit. But there are one or two things about mathematics. And the first was, what is the difference between a mathematical proof and a philosophical proof? Are proofs of God inescapable? This is a very important question. I hope I didn't use the word proof in my lecture at all. Yes, I did, with Euclid. Because the word proof has two distinct senses in most languages. There's a rigorous sense. And you only get that rigorous sense in my own field of axiomatic mathematics, where a proof has a strict meaning. It is that starting with these axioms, you can reach that conclusion inescapably on the basis of this logic. So assuming the axioms and the logic, then the conclusion is inescapable. That kind of proof you get nowhere else. You don't get it in natural sciences, you don't get it in philosophy, and you don't even get it when it comes to how do you know you love your wife and she loves you. Now this is very important, because loose use of the word proof leads to all kinds of confusion. And that's why I concentrated in my lecture on the word evidence. pointers, indicators. They're not, in that sense, knockdown proofs that every right-thinking person must logically accept. It's not like that. Let's think of an analogy. But it's a useful analogy because we need to get it out of our heads that God is merely a theory. God is a person. And therefore, a relationship with God in trust will be a complex, multi-dimensional thing. My relationship with my wife, let me tell you, is a complex, multi-dimensional thing as well. Now, I could not mathematically or rigorously prove to you that she loves me. I'd stake my life on it because there's sufficient evidence to convince me. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that the Boeing 747 that carried me from London to San Francisco 2 days ago was going to get me there. I staked my life on it, didn't I? In other words, it's very important to see that although on the one end of the spectrum, in the real world in which we live, there is no such thing as absolute proof. But that should not lead us to run away and think that there are no things of which we cannot be beyond all reasonable doubt certain. And that is very true of human relationships. And therefore, since God is a person and not a theory, it helps me to begin to understand that there's a multidimensional level of evidences. I mean, there is. When I turned up in Cambridge, I saw a girl. She was beautiful. I took through evidence through my eyes. You understand me so far? And then I took evidence through my ears. And then, you know, so it went on. I'll not go into all the details, but the point is that I got to such a stage, and of course, being a mathematician, I wanted to work it all out beforehand, so it took me 7 years. You can see that mathematicians have disadvantages in certain things. But she was very patient until I came to the point where I said, look, I would like you to marry me. I was wondering when you'd ask. You know, so I was prepared on the basis of the evidence to make a commitment. That is exactly what is involved in becoming a Christian. We investigate the evidence, and that's why these lectures are put on. And discussions happen in universities so that you can, with space, investigate. And you don't commit yourself to something like this without having real evidence. Otherwise, you're an idiot, if I might say so. And I wouldn't commit myself to atheism either, unless I was sure there was some strong evidence for it. There are two sides to the argument, you see. And one of the great things about a university in which the wind of freedom blows is that we can discuss these things freely. So thank you for that question, because it seems to me that it's very important. Now, there was a question about Kurt Gödel, and that's the pronunciation, by the way. He was an Austrian mathematician, arguably one of the most brilliant of the 20th century. And what he proved was that any adequate axiomatizable theory is incomplete, if that makes sense to you. And in any consistent axiomatizable theory, which can encode sequences of numbers, there will always be a true statement that is not provable. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that now at this time of night. It would bore you to tears. But the point is that it was thought by people like David Hilbert and others that mathematics, pure mathematics, was absolutely secure, that you could reduce all theorems, all true theorems, to manipulations of symbols. And you would eventually get to a stage where you could establish everything in an axiomatic system. And then he delivered what was like a nuclear bomb. That there would always be true theorems that you couldn't prove in the system. And if you extended the system, then it would go for that system too, and so on. Now, philosophers have discussed this for years. And the questioner is quite right to point out that there are limitations on it. The limitation that I would mention is that it applies to axiomatizable systems. Now, I'm going to suggest some reading material, because not everybody is interested in Kurt Gödel, I see. Roger Penrose Stephen Hawking's distinguished collaborator, still alive, working in Oxford today, an absolute genius. He argued that one of the implications of Gödel's theorem is that human thought is incomputable. Now, in Silicon Valley, you know all about that. In other words, you cannot, now here comes the importance of this and why it is so assailed and so controversial. In other words, you will not be able to reduce human thinking to a purely natural process. That has very big implications, of course. I would like to get some information theorists working on this. This I'm very interested in, actually, the question that you asked. And I've mentioned it in my little book, which I daren't advertise, but I'm going to. God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? Because one of the things I'm interested in as a mathematician is the fact that life is digital. And therefore, one of the big questions about life's origin, whatever mechanical and natural processes are involved, is where does digital information get its source? And whether theoretical computer science gives us any hints, and I think it does. Junk in, junk out is one of them. But then you know all about that in Silicon Valley because you've developed it into a fine art. I mean that in a complimentary way, of course. Now, I wasn't quite sure what the question meant about our visual systems and our tracking of reality is not the same as knowing the truth. But I think that kind of question is very interesting. I made some very negative comments about postmodernism at the beginning, and I stand by them, but there is a little slight positive side. The social critique of science has at least done us a service to the extent that it has told us that science is something that's done by scientists. And it's not the objective, dispassionate, rigorous observer, all the rest of it. It is that in part. And that, therefore, our knowledge of truth and our knowledge of reality, there's always going to be a bit of a disjunct. And therefore, I would agree with the question in that sense. Now, how do I approach that? The way I approach everything else. Evidence-based, ladies and gentlemen. Tracking reality in any area of life can sometimes lead us astray. We think we're keeping track of what's in our bank balance. But it goes astray for some reason. And the only way we can deal with that kind of question, I think, is Richard Feynman. I love reading Richard Feynman. There's a physicist here. Because Feynman said, bend over backwards to question your own presuppositions, because the easiest person that you can deceive is yourself. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, I've spent a lifetime putting my presuppositions on the line, as I've done tonight. I want to know what's true. I don't want to be fooled. I'm very aware I grew up in a Christian home and was taught to think against that worldview. That's why I'm fascinated by other worldviews. I want to know whether they're true or not. Now, maybe I'm not doing a good job of tracking reality, but the only thing I can do as me is track it as best I can. And by exposing it to many different people over many different years in many different languages and cultures, I build up a picture. So I become a person who's made decisions about my own worldview. That may seem a very weak thing, but I don't think it is. Because I think the wonderful thing about us is that we are creatures made in the image of God. And God has given evidence, and we can track it. And that brings me to a final point on this issue. One of the dangers that a lecture like this gives is that the whole process emanates from inside my own brain. That it's simply human intellectual endeavor. But half a minute. If there is a God that created the universe, there's another additional possibility, isn't there? That he's spoken. Oh, you say, goodness me, at this time of night, you're not going to begin to claim that there's such a thing as revelation. I am, ladies and gentlemen. I am. but I'm going to claim that it is not opposed to reason. There is the funniest of notions around the world today, that revelation, and I want to claim that Scripture is revelation, is opposed to reason. That's nonsense. I have never, ever met a person that can read the Bible without using their brain. Have you? The real issue at stake is this. There are different sources of information. By definition, atheism assumes there's only one source of information. That is the universe around us. Well, that's very limiting, because it can a priori shut out the possibility that there is another source of information, that God has spoken. And here's where we have to begin tracking not science, but history. Is there any evidence that that is the case? And that's why I didn't tonight, but that's why I place in my life a tremendous emphasis on science, on history, and thirdly, on personal experience. The Christian claim is obvious, that God, who is the Word, became human. Gosh, that's a colossal claim to make, isn't it? Well, is it true or not? What's the evidence? Let's investigate it. You can assume by definition that there is no God and therefore there's no evidence, but I wouldn't do that too prematurely, not in a university of this caliber. So that's how I would approach that. Now, there are two more. We've got a couple more minutes, haven't we?
Yes.
So let's pursue these. The search for God, Central African people are attached to traditions and so on. There hasn't been much science done there. And where is the disconnect? That's a very interesting question. I haven't a notion. I just don't know. But I like to think about it. It's a new question for me. And I would insult you coming from one of those countries, coming from that country, to suggest I had any idea of the answer to that. I would want to spend a few years talking to people. I do regret to say that I've only been in Africa once in my life, and that was in Rwanda just before the genocide. So I hadn't really time to study it. So I can't comment. So you'll have to let me pass on that. So there we are. You've found out that I don't know everything. We know so little, don't we? So little. So little. Every day I'm asked questions I don't know the answer to. I love it. It keeps you humble, doesn't it? What a tragedy it is when we come to think we know all the answers and we've got all the answers. The question is, can we know enough to trust? That's the question. Sorry, I'm beginning to lose my thing. Right. Why does Dawkins hold to the views he does, and Hitchens and so on? And why are they so popular? I can't second guess why people hold their views, really. I get all kinds of impressions about this. I don't know Richard Dawkins well enough to answer it, and he'd have to answer that for himself. That's the only fair way, isn't it? We must let these people speak for themselves. Sometimes, leaving Dawkins and Hitchens aside, I know Hitchens much better than Dawkins, it has very complex roots. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, that if I had to go to identify the body of my mother, who had just entered a suicide pact with a defrocked priest and committed suicide, I don't know how I'd feel about Christianity. That's what Christopher Hitchens faced as a young man. Breaks my heart, What an influence. That's the impression that he may have got of what Christianity is. And that relates to another question. And I'm so glad that the person put it. I talked about the evils of atheism. And this person very rightly reminded me to say something about Christendom that hasn't always been blameless in the way in which it has behaved. Has it? And we come full circle because we started in Northern Ireland. So here I am in the dock. What do I think of what happened in Northern Ireland? I'll tell you. It won't take me long. I'm utterly ashamed of it. That's what I think about it. Utterly ashamed of it. I'm utterly ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with violence. That's point number one. Point number two is this. But I notice that people that take guns and weapons to defend Christ or his message are not following him, they're disobeying him. Because he publicly forbade the use of weapons. It is very interesting because this charge against Christianity or Christendom is made by Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins all over the place. Their books are full of it, and with some justification. My response to it is, as I say, to be ashamed of it, but secondly, to point out that people that take their weapons to defend Christ are disobeying him. My kingdom is not of this world, he told the procurator Pilate, who was trying him on the very charge that the new atheists accuse him of, fomenting political violence. That was the charge for which they arrested Jesus. I hope you realize that. In modern terms, it was terrorism. And it is crucially important historically to establish whether that charge sticks or not. And Pilate investigated it, terrified of having trouble in Jerusalem at Passover, and said he found him guiltless. Why did he find him guiltless? Because Jesus said, you know, my kingdom's not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting. To this end I was born, he said. And to this end I came into the world, that I might bear witness to the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, the one thing you cannot do with guns is force truth on people. And especially if that truth is about the possibility of forgiveness and peace with God that's known in this life. It is an absurdity to think that that can be propagated by violence. John Lennon once wrote a song, didn't he? Imagine. Do you know the song Imagine? Imagine a world without religion. Imagine a world without Northern Ireland. Gosh, how anybody could imagine a world without Northern Ireland, I just don't know. But you know how it goes. Yes, I understand it. But I'm not John Lennon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Lennox. I hope you'd noticed. I've written a song. It's called Imagine. Imagine a world without Mao. Imagine a world without Pol Pot. Imagine a world without Stalin. What about that world? The new atheists are almost utterly silent about it and attempt to exonerate Hitler and Stalin by all sorts of devices, which I've just written another book about. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's been a sheer joy to be in Stanford. Good night.
Thanks again, Professor Lennox.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.